And now, in the flesh, as it were, we greet two prominent academics and activists in the field of Palestinian rights, Professor Joseph Massad of Columbia University, and we welcome a familiar face, Professor Ilan Pappe of Exeter University in England. Both men, one a Palestinian, the other an Israeli, are pursuing the struggle for one democratic state in places far from home. But then, as Chaim Weizmann discovered, changing the reality on the ground in Palestine also means changing the minds of those in power, in the centers of power in the West. Professor Massad has written extensively on the contradictions of the Jewish state. For example, in The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, where he analyzed the anti-Semitic basis of Zionism. Sounds interesting. Professor Pappe, who is proud to see himself as a socialist activist as well as an academic, wrote the groundbreaking The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, in which he detailed both the plans of the Jewish settlers to drive out the Palestinians and the way in which they did it. First to speak is Professor Pappe. He will consider the effect of the recognition of Palestine as an observer state by an overwhelming majority of members at the UN General Assembly last year. Was it really a turning point? Professor Pappe.
Thank you. Is this yours? I can use it. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you all for attending this important conference. My special thanks to Atia and Verena for the time, the energy, the commitment of arranging this conference. I really think that if we had few couples like that around the world, we will have not only one state, we will have a democratic state tomorrow. So if we can clone this partnership that they have in different places and cultures, a lot of what we try to do today would not be necessary. But we have only them in Stuttgart, and that's why we have to work hard. I was asked to speak about the significance of the United Nations resolution. I usually don't like to speak about a topic that I don't suggest myself. But as time went by, I warmed up to the idea. And I thought that despite the fact that by the time I will stand here in Stuttgart, quite a long time would pass since that moment, and so many other things have happened. Despite that fact, there is a very important question to be asked about the United Nations decision, because it is both an indication for the process that Richard Falk was talking about, namely a charade of peace that leads to nowhere, and is in danger of legitimizing internationally through the United Nations a process which would not promise liberation, democracy, or rights to the Palestinians. So that's one side of any United Nations action in the last 10 or 20 years. But on the other hand, this is the most important international podium. And symbolism in this case can also be a very positive development, in which you would say what matters is not only the symbol, but how do I understand that symbol? I wish, but I doubt, that when we talk about Palestine as a member state, or even on becoming a member state of the United Nations, I really wish that we would be talking about Palestine as nations are defined in the United Nations Charter. As you probably know, the United Nations Charter begins by saying, we the people of the world, not we the states of the world. So if the recognition of the United Nations was of Palestine as belonging to the Palestinian people, if it would include in its idea Joseph in America or Hanin in Haifa, I would be very elated, and I would have jumped from my chair, which I didn't when I heard about the United Nations decision, because I'm a bit cynical about this kind of definition. That does not mean that those of us who understand that symbol and understand the importance of the United Nations could still make an effort to cast that kind of meaning to the idea of Palestine. But of this, I think, we'll talk more tomorrow. I think today it's important to mention the balance of power that gives the meaning to that decision. And in order to understand the connection between the balance of power and what the recognition of Palestine in the United Nations means, one has to put things in a historical context, to my mind. And this is a good moment to think about the United Nations engagement with the issue of Palestine since the organization came into being in 1945. Because there are parallels between the United Nations Partition Resolution of November 1947 and the United Nations Resolution in 2012. Interestingly enough, the Palestinian leadership in 1947 rejected the United Nations idea of partitioning Palestine. The Palestinian leadership in 2013 accepted a Palestine that, at least according to the balance of power, is a mere 20% of Palestine. The United Nations approach is more important for me than the Palestinian response. As Richard Falk said and some others said, this is really up to the Palestinians to decide how they want to engage with this. So I come here as an historian and try to explain, if I can, if I will succeed, the United Nations as a body, as an organization, as a venue which attempts to represent an international consensus. How does it conceives Palestine when it uses the term Palestine, both in 1947 and in 2012, in order for us to be able probably to develop a sober approach toward that recognition. I have friends who would show you, and I'm sure those of you who bothered to read the United Nations resolution of the 29th of November 1947, Resolution 181, I have friends who would show you very positive aspects of that resolution in terms of justice, democracy, and equality. And they would be right when they would say that some chapters in the United Nations resolution were definitely based on these international values. But the important thing is not the text as much as the context. And the context was, in 1947, as it is in 2012, that there is one basic reality on the ground which all the United Nations resolutions, including the one that compared Zionism to racism in 1975, have ignored. The United Nations as a body that pretends to represent an international consensus at any given time totally ignored the existence of an imbalance on the ground between settlers, invaders, on the one hand, and native indigenous population on the other. From the very moment the United Nations spoke about Palestine, it spoke about a reality that did not exist on the ground, a reality in which you have two equal moral rights to a land. And what you have to do as an international community is to use logic, common sense, maybe historical precedents to find a practical solution, because there are two equal demands or rights to the land. And I don't think that the United Nations or the member states of the United Nations, the vast majority of them, who voted in 2012, are very different from the vast majority who voted in 1947. They decided that there's already a fait accompli in Palestine. There's already one fact that cannot be denied anymore. Of course, it was more ridiculous to adopt this point of view in 1947, when the settler community was 1/3 of the population, and the vast majority of them just came 3 years before. To say that this settler movement that mainly came in the 1940s has the same moral right as the indigenous native population, and to call it a peace plan, of course, is quite grotesque. It's more understandable if the United Nations comes to Israel and Palestine and says we already have a 3rd generation of settlers. And the 3rd generation of settlers pose a different problem for the native population than a 1st generation of settlers. 3rd generation of settlers begin to gel as an ethnic identity themselves, or as a community itself, and in many ways a post-colonial solution, as Richard Falk called it, has to take into account the 3rd generation being maybe an organic part of the reality, which was not the case in 1947. But to come and to use the term Palestine as a term that actually does not emerge from that history, but to use that term as it emerges from the Oslo process, is a very dangerous development. And I think that is what happened in the United Nations. As I said before, that doesn't mean we have to accept it as people. It doesn't mean we cannot try and cast a different meaning to the idea of Palestine. But it is very important that we would understand the motives and the concepts and the attitudes of those who voted for the resolution. On the one hand, one can say anything that irritates the Israeli government should have been welcomed by us. But it's at the same breath, we should remember that almost all the other center parties in Israel and left parties in Israel welcomed the resolution. And they knew why. They knew why, because it fitted into a strategy and vision that conceived the two states idea in its modern form. There are two states models. There's the two-state model of 1947, and one can see its attraction in 2013. One can see the attraction of someone coming and saying, you know what, let's adopt the map of 1947. Let's divide Palestine as the United Nations suggested to partition it in November 1947, because it includes, of course, some of the Palestinians who are part of the Palestinian minority in Israel. And because you may add to this the Resolution 194 and the right of return, and you have a far more viable nation state, if you want, of Palestine in about 46 to 47% of the land, and not on 22% of the land. But this is a different debate. One should not confuse that idea with the idea of the two states as it was born in 1967. And I wonder how many of you know at what moment in history was the idea conceived, who were the parents of this child, and who were the uncles and aunts, if you want, of that creation. It's very important to understand it. Contrary to the myth that maybe it was also part of a Palestinian strategy, like the strategy of the stages of 1972, the two states idea is a pure Zionist conception that was sold to the world as a peace process and succeeded at various moments in time in accepting international legitimacy, regional legitimacy, and also Palestinian legitimacy. When I say Palestinian, of course, I don't mean all the Palestinians, but I'm a certain Palestinian legitimacy. Were the people who granted the legitimacy aware that they were actually endorsing a Zionist plan? I don't know. It's still time to research this. I'm far more fascinated by the fact that they did not only endorse a Zionist plan, they endorsed a Zionist solution to a Zionist dilemma. The two states is a solution for a Zionist dilemma. And in the time that I have still, I don't know how long, but I'm waiting for the yellow card, I would like to give the historical background to that conception of the idea of the two states, describe the dilemma, and describe the two states as a solution to the dilemma, not to the conflict, to the Zionist dilemma. The Zionist ideology, and there's no need and no time to go into it, was to get as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible in it. And when the Zionist movement in Palestine was weak in numbers, when it was not certain that it would achieve international or gain international legitimacy, the idea of getting as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians in it was more of a vision than a plan, because you didn't have the means or the capacity to implement it. Somewhere in the mid-1930s, probably in the early 1940s, as a result of events here in Europe, and as a result of a certain achievements on the ground of the Zionist movement of building a state within a state, and the fact that the Jewish community of settlers in Palestine became 1/3 of the overall community, the vision became a plan, a strategy. And what was needed was a historical opportunity to implement this idea, and it came in 1948. 3 years after the Holocaust, the end of British rule, the fragmentation in the Arab world, and the concern in the Arab world about other national liberation struggles were all creating that moment, which I called in my book the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That operation in 1948 did not get Israel whole of Palestine and left a number of Palestinians inside Israel. And therefore, I think, the urge in the Zionist leadership ever since 1948 was to find a way of getting more territory with the hope that the incomplete ethnic cleansing would be solved by other means. They imposed military rule on the Palestinians inside Israel as one way of solving the problem of not having an exclusive Jewish state. And they solved the geographic problem by occupying the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and not bringing it back, and not getting out of it, I'm sorry. But of course, occupying the West Bank and the Gaza Strip meant incorporating 1.5 million Palestinians after you expelled 1 million Palestinians in 1948. So you may have created the space or the geography of what you thought was a viable state, but you created the nightmarish demography from a Zionist perspective. We have today the documents of the Israeli government of June 1967, immediately after the occupation. The decision that Israeli government took became the strategy of the State of Israel, and I don't think any Israeli government and any Zionist party, on the left or on the right, has deviated from the basic decisions taken in June 1967, as I say, which are now accessible to the researchers. This was a unique government, the 13th government of Israel. Every shade and every color in the Zionist political scene was represented in this government. Never before and never after would ever Israel have such a consensual government. And this is one reason why it felt it could take strategic decisions. It also included half of the members of that government were generals of the ethnic cleansing in 1948, who wrote all the time between 1948 and 1967 that it was a big mistake not to complete the ethnic cleansing and allow Jordan to have the West Bank. They were less interested in Gaza, but they were more interested in the West Bank. And they took 3 decisions. And with this I will conclude because I think it leads to the United Nations resolution I explained. They said we cannot ethnically cleanse the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The war is over, there is television, we are not sure the refugees would be willing to become refugees in the second time, and we are not sure about the Israeli army, whether it would be as committed as we were in 1948, they said. So ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip on massive scale was ruled out. Then came the question, so do we give them citizenship if we don't expel them? That, of course, was ruled out. You can't give them citizenship because they won't have a Jewish democracy. You'll have a democracy, but not a Jewish democracy. The third question was, do we need to control the West Bank, or maybe we can give the West Bank with the citizens, with the people who live there, or give Gaza with the people who live there. The first to Jordan, the second to Egypt. That was still an option in 1967. Or even give it, who knows, to the Palestinian people. That was totally ruled out. In fact, it's quite surprising. There were official, I didn't know, maybe some of you do remember this, but there were official press conferences by the Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, in which he said, we will negotiate over the Golan Heights. We will negotiate over the Sinai. But the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are not negotiable. It's amazing. I thought I discovered it as a secret Israeli kind of understanding. But apparently the world knew that the Israelis are not going to treat the West Bank and the Gaza Strip the way they treat the areas they've occupied from Syria and Egypt. So they decided that there is a tactical question, how to rule the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But there is no strategic question, should we be the one who rule it? That was the main decision. We have to rule the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And they devised a plan which I think most Israeli governments adhere to, which said we do not need to rule directly areas which are densely populated by Palestinians. And we can allow the Palestinians in those areas to have a kind of autonomy. Now, should the Palestinians accept our vision of rule, then we can allow them what I would call, it's not their words, but it's my understanding, have a kind of a version of an open prison. They can have autonomous life in an open prison. Should they resist, we shall punish them with an ultra-maximum prison. And the open prison model developed, but already in 1967, 3 leading Israeli ministers said that we have to do 2 things in the years to come. One is to try and develop the idea of the open prison so that maybe one day it will be called the Palestinian state, because it would be easier to sell it to the world. In practice, it would not be a state. In practice, it would be a Palestinian autonomous area within the general area that Israel controls and rules forever. That's one thing. The second thing is to call the development of the idea of the open prison as a state a peace process. And the dividends were there. 3 Peace Nobel Prize they got for this. And eventually, I think, and with this I would end, and I'm sorry I took more than my time, the United Nations, unfortunately to my mind, the vast majority of the people who represented their states as ambassadors in the United Nations voted for the open prison model it's not even a Bantustan, it's an open prison model which Israel tolerates within the West Bank, that as far as the international community and quite a lot of people in Israel can be called Palestine. Of course, as I said, we can challenge that symbol, but we should be aware the importance that the balance of power in the world and in the region and on the ground, we should be aware that this is the one that gives right now the content to the word Palestine as it appears in the United Nations resolution. Well, if we ever succeed in changing that balance of power, then of course that symbol would have a different meaning. But as far as we are concerned, it legitimizes Israel as a settler colonialist state, not over 50% of Palestine as in 1947, not over 80% of Palestine as it did in 1967, but over more or less 90 to 92% of Palestine. There was no reason to go and dance in the streets for such a resolution. Thank you.